Okay, we're connected. I'm going to try again. I'm going to cover the same topic this week because last week the stream uh, died on me halfway through. It's frustrating because I didn't know it was off, and I just kept talking to the wind. So let's hope the deities of the internet are in a more favorable mood this week. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Okay, so um, I'm just going to speak again about the same theme as last time because last time we lost the internet connection or YouTube connection halfway through. Um, what I'm going to talk about is uh, how we can understand the idea of artificial intelligence from a Buddhist perspective. So, the first point that needs to be made is a clarification of terms. What do we mean by intelligence and what do we mean by consciousness? Because I think in the popular discourse, these often get muddled, and people assume that if a program or an artificial entity of some kind is sufficiently intelligent, then it must be conscious. And I think this is quite wrong because the two concepts are not the same, and they're quite separate from each other. Is the manipulation of data, and it uses algorithms. Algorithms is an algorithm. It's a mathematical term meaning a procedure that can be specified in a step-by-step manner. If A, then B, if C, then not A, whatever. You have a chain of uh, preset manipulations. Now, with a human being, these are extremely subtle and complex, but we do have um, the same sort of limitations to our intelligence. Our intelligence can only operate, first of all, on the data that it has, and within the limits of its biological framework. So humans have more intelligence than other animals, but they're still processing information in a similar way. And of course, with the biological organisms, it's also complicated by uh, biological inputs that are not present in machines, like hormones and various kind of brain chemicals, dopamine, whatever, which will affect the thinking process. Consciousness is quite other than this. Consciousness is, and by consciousness, I'm using it in the sense of chitta in the Pali. Consciousness is the simple knowing in the sense of experiencing, not in the sense of understanding. Um, the very simple but profoundly important act of being aware that uh, we're continually experiencing that throughout our life. According to Abhidhamma theory, there's even a rudimentary form of consciousness present in deep sleep. And each moment, consciousness is taking an object, it's experiencing an object. And then the object known by consciousness is processed by other mental factors, but these, such as perception and mental formations. But the raw, immediate experience of having a sense impression or being aware of a thought is consciousness. Now, consciousness is difficult to understand or explain, not because it's complicated, but because it's so intrinsically simple. It's immediate. It's the most intimate part of our being, you know. And in the last analysis, it's really the only factor we can be sure of. We know we're conscious, but everything else we experience has been filtered through first consciousness, then perception, and feelings and mental formations. This simplicity of consciousness means that it cannot, even in theory, be algorithmic. There's no possible way to break it down into stepwise procedures. Consciousness just immediately occurs. There's no kind of process to it. All the processing is in the back end, comes after the experience of consciousness. There's a whole literature in modern times that of philosophers talking about what they call the theory of mind, or and the big question is consciousness. It's called the hard problem, because it's really impossible to explain in a purely materialist paradigm. There's no possible way you can work an algorithm to explain consciousness. And if it were dependent on a physical base, if it arose out of materiality, it would need to be algorithmic. Whether that base is silicon integrated circuitry, or whether it's carbon-based wetware, you know, in the brain. The relation between mind and brain is a related question here, and I think the bias in modern times is to compare the brain to a computer. And in some functions that may work, but there's no way that explains consciousness. And this is admitted. Nobody can explain consciousness. The most materialist commentators on this topic will just say, well, it must be material, and we just haven't figured out the mechanism yet. But no one comes even close. There's some I think assumption in some circles to imagine that when a system becomes complex enough, that consciousness arises out of complexity somehow. But this is really a kind of magical thinking. It's not an explanation. It's obvious to us that the brain has some relation to mind and to thinking, perception, and so on. But to compare it to a computer, I think, is misleading. Um, and this, I think, it comes largely from our own fascination with our own creations. I think a better analogy for a brain, if we must have a technological metaphor, a better analogy would be a radio receiver. That the brain acts as the physical interface between mind and the rest of the body. We know that brain processes occur through the uh, firing of neurons. This is an electrochemical information exchange. It's like a multiprocessor. If we revert to the computer model, it's like a multiprocessor computer that self-programs. That these pathways can be adapted through use. But the question is really what determines which neurons are going to fire. So I would propose it's probably closer to reality to think of the mind causing the firing of neurons rather than the firing of neurons causing the mind. This is the formula of the dependent origination, after all, because of consciousness, name, and form. When consciousness patisandhi vijnana, the rebirth consciousness, arises in a womb, then the embryo unfolds. That's the kind of kernel. There's the three things. There's the father's sperm, the mother's egg, and there's the consciousness seeking rebirth. And if any of these are missing, then a being doesn't form. The consciousness has to be one of the key components here. That it's insubstantial, it's empty of substance. And this is something to put as a caution whenever you're thinking about consciousness, is not to be trapped by language, by the linguistic formula. Because it doesn't matter which language you're speaking, whether it's English or French or Pali or Thai or whatever it might be. We refer to consciousness by a noun. In English, we say consciousness. In Pali, we say chitta. So the use of a noun leads to a false assumption that we're talking about something, and we're not. It's really like a process. It's really like just an occurrence, an event. It's more like a verb than a noun. It's empty of substance. So now let's kind of shift gears to the main theme. I've clarified terms a bit, the Buddhist understanding of consciousness and thinking, and how they're different. Now let's consider what's a big topic these days is artificial intelligence or machine intelligence. Now, first of all, a machine of any kind must operate by an algorithm. These algorithms can be very complex, and it's theoretically possible to have even more complexity by using a base with multi-processors, or even there's some experimentation with quantum computing that uses superimposed states, superposition states, to multiply the possible information transfers and manipulations. But this is a matter really of degree rather than of kind. The computer only operates by manipulating data that has been input into it. And one, advance in an important advance in terms of machine intelligence is self-learning programs. This is a sophisticated kind of looping that a software program can essentially write itself over time, but it still requires initial inputs to do that. There's one example that I know a little bit about from having used it is optical character recognition. I used to have a really good piece of software that did optical character recognition, and you could take a page of text and scan it in, and then instead of just being recorded as an image, the program would go through it character by character and interpret it and output editable text. And the way it worked was it had a database of possible characters that were bitmapped. And if it spotted a character that was numerically close to the bitmap of a known character, it would output that character. So after you run one page through, then you would have to go through the text and edit it, correct it, so that if the machine had seen an E as an A, you tell it, no, this is an E. And the first time you ran a page if you were running several pages from a book, say, that had, so it would have the same font and the same kind of texture from page to page. The first time you ran it through, you would have to make a lot of corrections, but then it would adapt its recognition, would adapt its database, and the second time through, there would be much less. And by the time you were 4 or 5 pages in, it would require almost no correction on the user's part. So it was a direct self-learning, but it took that coaching from the outside, from the user, to manage the learning. This is similar to, in a more complex way, with these programs that are available now on the internet, like ChatGPT, and there are others. They've got thousands and thousands of people using them, and they're learning from their interactions with humans. They're self-writing their own code and adjusting their internal database, so that they become more and more sophisticated over time. But this does not imply any consciousness on the part of the software. It's simply running a very complex algorithm. There's nothing at the other end that knows what's happening. I think this is a kind of philosophical problem with talking about consciousness in different entities, is that there's really no way, unless except leaving aside someone who has advanced psychic powers, just for the ordinary person, there's no way you can tell if any other entity is conscious from the outside. It's the only entity in the universe that is conscious, that you really know experientially, is yourself. But it seems madness to not assume that other human beings at least are conscious. And in the Buddhist theory, all animal life would be considered conscious. And we're making this assumption from the outside, and it seems like a completely reasonable assumption to assume that another human being is conscious. That there's no really argument against it. Um, we know it by analogy from ourselves and from the uh, actions and responses of the person. But when we apply it to this kind of question to a completely alien entity that's not uh, animal life, it's not biological at all, like a computer running a software, how do we determine whether it might be conscious or not? The old standard, the originals, going back decades, it was called the Turing test. It was proposed by the pioneer computer theorist Alan Turing. And when he proposed this, it seemed very remote that it would ever be possible. Like this, I think it goes back to like the 1930s or 40s when he came up with this. The idea of the Turing test is that a person interacting with this software would have no way of knowing whether there's actually another human being at the other end of the communication typing, or if it's a machine generating the text. No, it would simulate a human conversation so well that you couldn't tell the difference. And the modern iterations of the software are very close to that, if not there already. I think that they would fool probably 90% of the people completely. You wouldn't know that it's not a human being typing at the other end. Someone with a bit of sophistication about software procedures might be able to come up with trick questions and know, oh yeah, okay, this is a computer. But their simulation of human interaction is really good. But then human conversation itself is basically algorithmic, so that the Turing test is not really definitive. So there's really no way of knowing. But I would still suggest that there is no consciousness. There is no there, because of the limitation of a machine of being able to only operate on algorithms that would preclude the idea of consciousness. There's a story that's told about the Dalai Lama. Now, I've heard this story a couple of times in slightly different versions, and I don't know whether it's really happened or whether it's entirely apocryphal, but it's a good story anyway. It makes a point. That the Dalai Lama was meeting with some Western scientists, and he does that sort of thing. He is interested in science, and they were talking about they got onto the topic of machine intelligence, and he asked, one of the scientists asked the Dalai Lama, "What do you think? Do you think a computer could ever be truly conscious?" And the Dalai Lama's first answer was a definitive no. But when they pressed him on it, he finally said, "Well, maybe, but only if it was someone like you," pointing to one of these computer guys. If it's someone like you that's reborn into it. And it's a sort of a humorous way of making the point that consciousness, this is another attribute of consciousness in Buddhist understanding, that consciousness is dependently arisen. It arises according to causes and conditions. And in each moment, one of the conditions is the sense organ, another is the object, but also one of the necessary causes is a previous moment of consciousness. There's an unbroken chain of moments of consciousness. If that were not so, then consciousness would have to arise out of nothing, and it would be an uncaused event, which is a total violation of the laws of causality. You can't have a creation out of nothing. Creatio ex nihilo. It's not. Uh, it's not something that really happens. So, in a human lifetime, each moment of consciousness has a previous moment. But what about the first moment? And this is one of the principal arguments for the reality of rebirth that we find, is that consciousness arising in the womb for the first time can't be a new creation. It can't be something that just arose out of nothing. It had to have previous causes. And the principal cause in the case of the first arising is the rebirth linking consciousness from a being that has deceased. So any entity that's conscious must be a reborn entity. So with that idea in mind, if we accept that, then we cannot absolutely rule out that a machine would never be conscious, because who knows, at some time some being would have the suitable karma to be reborn into a computer process. It seems unlikely to me on the face of it, but who knows? I mean, I can't rule it out absolutely. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, anywhere near that possibility happening. All we have at this point are very sophisticated programs that run algorithms and adapt their algorithms, self-adapt their algorithms as they go, learning from external inputs, and have access to extensive databases, which increases their effective intelligence. So they have the ability to manipulate data on a very refined level. So even in determining what is a true machine intelligence is kind of a shifting goalpost. I mentioned the Turing test. I'd also like to mention a book that I read years ago. It was a short little book, and it was very well written, very interesting book. It was on chess. It was called The History of Chess, and it was written in the 1940s. Okay, and at the very end of the book, there was a chapter, The Future of Chess, and the authors started out by saying there's currently some speculation that one day a machine will be able to play chess. And then he quite conclusively proved in the next several paragraphs that this would never happen. It was quite impossible. So that was considered to be impossible in the 1940s, at least by this author, and his arguments were sound. So this is the level of understanding they had. Then at some decades later, I remember that when they first started talking about possibility of facial recognition, they thought no, and there were some people saying no, this is a threshold. No machine will ever be able to successfully recognize human faces. It's way too subtle, and now we have facial recognition software. So defining of what is truly intelligent is itself a shifting goalpost. So, people will always be looking to the next horizon, but that's still a quite separate issue from being conscious or not. And so we should make this point clear and understand it. And finally, the relation between consciousness and intelligence. If a entity is not truly conscious, it can never act independently. It can never exercise free will. So some of the scenarios, the science fiction scenarios about computers or robots enslaving mankind, it seems unlikely. Although there is the possibility of inadvertent software loops. Somebody brought up this example. I remember reading this not long ago about, let's say that there was a machine to make paper clips that had artificial intelligence, and the paperclip company wanted to outproduce their competitors. So they just told this machine, just make as many paper clips as quickly as you can. And it was a self-learning machine, so it kept trying to find better ways to make more paper clips and more quickly. That was its only directive. And it ended up assembling the entire matter of the earth, just busting up the whole planet to make paper clips. Of course, this is a ridiculous scenario, and it could always be aborted by the humans. If they saw it was getting out of control, it started tearing up the shop floor to make more paper clips. They could just turn it off and adjust the programming. But these kind of inadvertent results, if something is taken to a logical extreme, this is more of a problem than a computer actually operating out of free will. So I think I've rambled enough. I think I've covered the ground I wanted to last week. There obviously was some repetition, but I think I got in the points I wanted to make. So I'll stop there, and we'll look at the chat and see what I can deal with here. Some questions. Okay. Do you believe that an AI robot could ever comprehend the concept of Atman as Brahman as described in the Upanishads? Depends what you mean by comprehend. It can't. If it's not conscious, it can't really know anything. Certainly not as subtle concepts like that. But if you were to input, and I'm sure if you went on ChatGPT right now and asked it to explain the Upanishadic concept of Atman as Brahman, it would come out with a very cogent answer. Because all you would have to do is to input into it the text of the Upanishads and the algorithms for manipulating language, and it wouldn't know. It doesn't really know in a human sense of what it's talking about, but it sounds very convincing. There was one of these philosophers of mind who was speculating about the nature of consciousness, and this is written long before there were computer programs as sophisticated as there are now. And he came up with a kind of thought experiment that he called the Chinese room. If you had if time wasn't a factor, let's say you had a completely sealed room, and there was a man in the room who didn't know a word of Chinese, but he had these books and cards with Chinese letters on them, and books with rules for manipulating the characters. And people on the outside could pose him questions in Chinese, and he could then manipulate, following the rules set out in these books. He could manipulate the characters and come up with an answer and output it. and he wouldn't know what he's talking about, or what any of it means, but it would be meaningful to the questioner. That's basically what a computer is doing. Could AI eventually think independently, like making their own society, but they won't ever be able to feel emotions like we do? Um, I don't really see that why they would make a society or act in that manner without consciousness. They would only the only way I could see that happening is if um, the computer programmers wanted to do that as an experiment and a sociological kind of modeling modules in the software representing individuals and have them interact in an economic, social way. Um, you could even program in simulated emotions into that if you wanted. Right? If one module was taking advantage of another, the other one could feel envy or anger, or not feel it. We should be more precise. It could then manifest behavior that simulates uh, a conscious entity who felt those emotions. Is there a way to know where consciousness originating from, dependent origination? Well, in ultimately, it arises out of craving and ignorance, because we engage in samsara because of those factors. Um, but in the moment by moment stream, it's arising from the previous moment of consciousness plus the sense organ and the object. Do you think it is possible to upload consciousness into a machine? Would that not be a form of reincarnation? No, I don't think that's possible. I think that's nonsense. Um, there's because as I don't hold consciousness to be algorithmic. The closest I could see to that happening would be some way of reading brain patterns, and I also think because brain patterns are so much in flux all the time, I don't really see even this as technically possible, but who knows? And then replicating them onto a electronic base, and then you could simulate an entity, and maybe a video or a hologram of an entity that resembled the original, and behavior and speech could resemble the original, but it wouldn't be conscious, and it would just be a like a sophisticated photograph or mirror. Do you think it is possible? Okay, I read that one. In your opinion, could a robot ever? Sorry, I lost the. In your opinion, could a robot ever be possessed by a disembodied spirit and potentially lead to questionable evil actions? Um, that's actually an interesting question, but I don't see that at the present time. As I said, theoretically, who knows? Some day in the future, they might have sophisticated enough hardware and software that an entity could be reborn into it. And that would be the same sort of thing as what you're asking. Because there is no awareness and no self at the other end of a chat GPT, it's just not anatta in a way. Well, it's emptiness, but it's not. I suppose you could make the argument that it's anatta, but it's not really what's meant by anatta. It's it's sunyata, is like you wouldn't, like, let's say you a simple machine like a wind up alarm clock. There's no sense of self, but it does its procedure. It's algorithmic. Uh, Turning of the gears causes the hands to turn. But it would seem sort of what's the word, like trivial, or not really appropriate to say it's anatta. It's telling the time. Anatta, it's emptiness, because there's no there's no question of there being a self, so it seems pointless to point out that there isn't one. It seems strange that consciousness can arise without it being a result of an existing consciousness stream. However, consciousness can cease in Buddhism. Can you explain this asymmetry? Um, well, if you're referring to uh, nibbana, it's the only time we could say that the cause and effect stream comes to an end. Um, and there is a kind of asymmetry in if you are uh, stuck in a paradigm of linear time, then it does seem to be an asymmetry. But um, in practice, samsara is without beginning, without end, and the number of beings. If Buddhaghosa is if we're to take him at his word, the number of beings in the universe is infinite. So if you subtract a finite number from an infinite number, you still have an infinite number. Ajahn, to create conscious AIs, we first need to somehow begin or manifest ignorance and sankharas. Could it be possible, even though the wheel of samsara and the law of karma is beginningless? Um, I'm not sure I really know what you mean here. To create conscious AIs, I think the my discourse here was that I believe that to be highly unlikely, if not impossible, and that if one were to become conscious, it would have to be some previous entity, or biological entity, being reborn into it. So it wouldn't be without a cause. And even at the level of intelligence, the manipulation of information and data, that's also not just arising out of nothing in a computer, because some human beings who have their own intelligence and manipulation of information had to code that initial algorithm to start with. If AI do somehow become conscious, since they lack greed, hate, and delusion, due to it not being programmed, would they technically be arahants? Conscious, since they lack greed, hate, and delusion, due to it not being programmed, would they technically be arahants? That's also an interesting question. I don't until that happens. I don't know. They may have their own versions of those. Maybe there's greed for more information. I certainly see delusion could be. I don't see why delusion would be ruled out. Are actions taken during dreams karma making? No. This is, well, at least according to the Abhidharma theory, anything that's done in a dream is karma free. You said in video 2 weeks ago that there can be nothing in existence without consciousness, but what about the realms, the perceptuals, Brahma gods, and Nibbana? The beings that have entered Nibbana, that's a whole nother question that it's outside the parameters of our language ability to speak about existence or non-existence, consciousness or unconsciousness. It doesn't apply. But the perceptionless Brahmas, their consciousness is not ceased, but it's put on hold. It's just a very long period of time, maybe 100 kappas between this consciousness moment and the next consciousness moment, but the stream is said to be unbroken. Thank you for a talk that has given me food for thought. I have long rejected the idea that consciousness is an emergent quality upon degree of complexity of the matrix. Okay. 2 weeks ago, you talk about the Tibetan idea of great emptiness and universal potential, and all things come out of it. Where does Nibbana fit in this picture? You're always trying to pin down some definition of Nibbana. Just give it up. You can't grasp Nibbana or encase it in words and definitions. Assuming that one can take rebirth spontaneously as a Dewa, Peter, Hell realm, why would taking rebirth as consciousness AI be any less likely? I think it would be less likely because, well, in the cases you're speaking about, like a Dewa, they're arising in a form. They have a form. They have a body. It arises spontaneously. So that becomes the body-mind vehicle. With a AI, you would have already a physical vehicle, is the hardware running the computer program, and whether that hardware is compatible with consciousness that's the question. I find it unlikely, but as I said, I wouldn't rule it out as absolutely impossible. Let's see, where am I going here? If the brain is a radio receiver that intercepts with consciousness and the AI is an algorithm that intercepts with our output, then the AI could never function without us as the in-between, could it? Yeah, that's actually a good point. Ultimately, the AI is not self-sustaining. It requires initial programming or coding by human beings, and it learns through interaction with human beings. Now, it is, I think, not 100% impossible to see it as developing some independence, in that once it's kind of bootstrapped from the initial algorithm, you could have it continually writing its own code and working from the established database. But it would, but it's still all based originally on human input. Is in Buddhism teaching space for collective consciousness idea, like all different parts of consciousness arising from a bigger source, and they're immediately connected to it? Not really. Not in the Theravada Abhidhamma model. There is, although there is a kind of some room for the idea of collective consciousness, in that there is recognized the possibility of extrasensory perception, of one mind knowing another. So they would have to be, the minds would have to be in touch in some way. But what about keeping the brain alive outside the body? That seems possible. I don't know. I don't know enough about the biology of the inputs needed for the brain. I think it would be a pretty horrible existence. Where would chitta arise from? Previous moments of chitta. Would AI consciousness be a heaven or hell realm? Probably closest to a Peta realm. Restlessness is a fetter that is only overcome by arahants. However, sloth and torpor is not on the list of fetters. So does that mean this can never be overcome completely, even by an arahant? No, I don't think that's. I don't think that's implied. Like the fetters is a list of specific defilements that are overcome at different stages of enlightenment. And sloth and torpor occurs in another list that relates to the jhanas, the nirvanas. But it's also stated that an arahant has no unwholesome consciousness moments. There's no akusala consciousness moments. So that would include sloth and torpor. So I think an arahant we can assume is free of sloth and torpor. Okay, let's just do maybe one or two more here. Okay. There's a whole bunch of questions here, but I'm looking for any that relate directly to the topic that I can deal with. I don't see any of this, so I think I'll stop there before I lose the stream too. I think we made it this time to the end of what I wanted to talk about without interruption. So happy about that, and we'll find a different topic for next week.